Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and I'll be reading to you a letter to the editor that I wrote that was published August 29th, 2024 in a family-owned newspaper that doesn't censor. They entitled it, "Stand with Ukraine Act Severely Flawed." I write about the Stand with Ukraine Act that's proposed by Senators Blumenthal and Graham. And what caught my attention was reading praise of this act written by a member of the Atlantic Council. And the Atlantic Council is a very pro-NATO group that's tightly tied with the Council on Foreign Relations that I talked about in my last video about plutocracy. So here's the letter. U.S. Senators Blumenthal and Graham's proposed Stand with Ukraine Act is glowingly described by the Atlantic Council's Andrew Danieri as a bipartisan proposal of vision and vigor, rather than the monopartisan display of deadly greed, prejudice, and incompetence that it is. The pro-NATO Atlantic Council and Albright Stonebridge Group, Danieri's previous workplace, are tightly connected with the Council on Foreign Relations, which shapes U.S. policy and public opinion to serve the plutocratic interests called U.S. interests of the ultra-wealthy. These investors and leaders of private equity firms, banks, and corporations, while clever at profiting off others' labor and resources, have no credentials for making foreign policy. Devoid of conflict resolution skills, they're driven by wealth obsessions, ignorant prejudice, and competitive mentalities that spawn belligerence. The proposed act calls for Ukraine's membership in NATO, thus insanely ignoring a major cause of the war. The act supports the Biden-Zelensky bilateral security agreement, which lavishly calls for the massive U.S. buildup of Ukraine's entire military apparatus, and hints at opportunities in Ukraine for U.S. investors. Casting aside nonviolent problem-solving, the act allows Ukraine to attack Russia with U.S. weapons. Buttressed by illogic, Danieri irresponsibly declares that this won't escalate war. Lastly, the act promotes U.S. access to Ukraine's mineral wealth. This is slickly presented as if avarice were a surprising afterthought rather than an ulterior motive. Instead of cooperatively tending to all sides' legitimate grievances, the act perpetuates the false good versus evil drama that indulges prejudice, justifies violence, and facilitates economic conquest. Words cannot describe the rage that I feel, how enraging it is to be ruled by fools. Fools who, because of their policies, millions have died over the decades. And in this last conflict, already hundreds of thousands have died. I think more than 1 million have probably died by now, including civilians. It's enraging, and it's about what's driving them is greed, prejudice, decades of prejudice, even in the entertainment industry, bombarding the mind. I saw it in elementary school when people would insult each other as pinko commies or something like that. And even as an adult, I see it in the children making Russian jokes. In the TV industry, movie industry, Russians are portrayed as malicious, cruel, sinister. Even in a very good movie, Air Bud, about a dog. Even there, it was a recent movie, I think, certainly within the past 20 years. The Russians are the antagonists again, and they're portrayed as stupid, sinister, and silly, and foolish. The prejudice against an enemy is the last prejudice that's ever going to die. And the planet might die before that prejudice dies. Because the United States and Americans will be so self-righteous, about saying, oh, we can't be prejudiced against them, we can't be prejudiced against them, we embrace diversity. Yet the U.S. government has such a prejudice against its adversaries. Whether they're terrorists, Muslim terrorists, Russians, the leaders of North Korea, left-wing Latino leaders. It's extreme prejudice. It's prejudice also against certain economic ideologies that don't cater to the interests of U.S. investors and U.S. corporate leaders who want to make money off of those other countries. I think that's why communism wasn't liked. I mean, Stalin certainly gave a bad name to it, right? But he was there only about 20 years. What's the cause of all the communism since then? I think it's because U.S. investors can't get their money. They can't get their hands on the money of other countries if that country is communist or socialist, or if there's just more rules about money making, like rules about worker safety, rules about community health, rules about environmental safety. The more rules there are, the less profit these greedy people can make. These avaricious, cruel people. And then melded with that greed, as I said, is prejudice. It's greed and prejudice. And then the big group think. Like, oh, it's cool to jeer at Putin. That's the cool thing to do. It's just like middle school. It's disgusting. And to hear the propaganda, to hear people like me who say things in support of Putin's statements and the legitimate grievances of Russia, to hear people like that being condemned as informants or information terrorists is absolutely disgusting. So I read this letter, I'm always hoping it can somehow make a difference. And I noticed a week later, Russia Today had an article, like, ooh, I'm not supposed to look at Russia Today. I've seen so much propaganda in the U.S. news. I haven't seen propaganda in Russia Today. But they had an article about Senator Graham, one of the co-sponsors of that act. And he's talking about, here's his quote, they, and he's referring to the Ukrainians, are sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be good to our economy. Now when they say economy, they don't mean good for all of us. They mean good for them, for the ultra-wealthy people, for their wallets. Even if it were good for us, I wouldn't care, because it's harming other people, right? So he says, so I want to keep helping our friends in Ukraine. See, that's why. That's why he wants to keep helping our friends. He calls them friends. They're pawns. They're being used. We can witness. They need our help. Oh yeah, help to the grave, right? Send them more weapons. Graham, what I know about Graham is he's a grown man who's never gotten over the monsters under the bed. These psychological fears. And we all have psychological weaknesses, problems. But when those psychological weaknesses are in people who are in power, it's totally irresponsible and reckless. And to have nobody containing him and constraining these people is awful. And then the article also has a quote from the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev, who says, according to open source data, the total value of Ukraine's former mineral resource base is estimated at almost $14.8 trillion. But, now listen to this, $7.3 trillion of this is now in the Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics. That means almost half of the former Ukraine's national wealth is in Donbass. And he adds, to get access to the coveted minerals, the Western parasites shamelessly demand that their wards wage war to the last Ukrainian. I think a lot of people, like myself, a lot of other people who are familiar with U.S. foreign policy history, knew that when the U.S. didn't want Ukraine to let those eastern regions go and become independent, it's because the U.S. government wanted something out of those republics. It wanted access to the Black Sea for NATO, for bases. It wanted access to the fossil fuels, and it wants access to the minerals. It wants access to the land. The U.S. will support a secession if its puppet is the leader of that group that wants to secede. Like in Katanga, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, back in the 1960s. The U.S. government wanted Katanga to secede because it had minerals in it, and the U.S. had its puppet in power. But the leader of the entire nation, Democratic Republic of Congo, was not a U.S. puppet. So since the U.S. didn't have control over the national leader, it wanted this section to secede. And it ended up destroying the leader, toppling him, and he was butchered. Patrice Lumumba. And you see it again and again. In Indonesia, too. They wanted secession, also in the 1960s, because it wanted access. The U.S. policymakers and their business colleagues, they're all one and the same group, these ultra-wealthy people. They wanted the money, the mineral wealth from the islands of Indonesia. But if the U.S. government already has its puppet in power over the entire nation, as it does in Ukraine, then it doesn't want anyone to secede, because it's got its puppet in power over the entire nation. It's a bunch of lies we're getting, and it's enraging. Thank you very much for listening. Take care. Good night.